Hello everyone, happy World Book Day and welcome to the Masked Reader. Now, in a second, I'm going to read you an extract from one of my favourite books. And while you're listening, I'd like you to try and work out 4 things. Number 1, who am I? I'm going to give you a clue, I'm not a potato. Number 2, what's the title of the book I'm reading? Now you need to be really specific because the book I'm reading comes in a series, so I need the exact title. Number 3, who is the author? And number 4, who is the publisher? Right, ready? Here we go. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they'd never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. There you go. Right, 4 things, remember. Number 1, who am I? Number 2, what is the exact title of the book? Number 3, who's the author? And number 4, who is the publisher? Happy World Book Day. Bye.
Hello, children. Here's my story. The barn was pleasantly warm in winter when the animals spent most of their time indoors. And it was pleasantly cool in summer when the big doors stood open, wide open to the breeze. The barn had stalls on the main floor for the workhorses, tie-ups on the main floor for the cows, a sheepfold down below for the sheep, a pig pen down below for Wilbur. And it was full of all sorts of things that you find in barns. Ladders, grindstones, pitchforks, monkey wrenches, scythes, lawnmowers, snow shovels, axe handles, milk pails, water buckets, empty grain sacks, and rusty rat traps. It was the kind of barn that swallows like to build their nests in. It was the kind of barn that children like to play in. And the whole thing was owned by Fern's uncle, Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman.
Hello, happy World Book Day. I am here to read an extract from a really, really good book. It's one of my favourites, and I always read it to my class as the first book. I'll read a short bit, and then I want you to guess what the book is, who the author is, who the illustrator is, and of course, who am I? Listen carefully. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning, so be a good boy and don't get into mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock sharp, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, George said. And try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, said George. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother. He didn't have a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there were never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grizzly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, said Grandma to George. That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, George said. He couldn't help disliking his grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered mouth like a dog's bottom. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her. 1 spoon, and no milk, she said. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day, every day, sitting in a chair by her window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, well, how are you this morning, George? Or why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went to the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in. George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully in to his grandma. Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have a cup without a saucer. George fetched her a saucer. And what about a teaspoon, if you please? I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon. George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George around like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him very badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can, she snapped. Growing's a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little, the woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty, childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up on any of those things, have you? I'm only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a look at Grandma. She certainly wasn't a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of her armchair. Daddy says it's fine for me to be a tall man, said George. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. How do I stop myself growing? George asked her. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy, who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's good for you, that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day, mountains of cabbage, and if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. Oh, George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up before it crawls away. Oh, delicious. She squeezed her lips together so tight that her mouth became a wrinkly hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetle bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing her pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be very quick, my dear, when you put one of those in your mouth. It has a pair of sharp nippers on its back. And if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she beckoned with her horny finger. Come closer to me and I'll tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma and she'll whisper you secrets. George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened of your old Grandma, she said, smiling that icy smile again. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said, and all at once, leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a throaty sort of voice George had never heard her use before. Some of us have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes. A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and spark in our bellies, wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets. George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off. Your teeth grow out of your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him the most of all. The frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you. Grandma, he cried out, stop! We know secrets, my dear, about the dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her saying. You won't ever get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Do you know what the title of that book is? Who the author is? Who the illustrator is? Or even who I am?
Hi children, welcome to World Book Day. Today I'm going to read you a story, but while I'm reading you have to think, who am I? What is the title of the book? And who is the author? Off we go. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory. And what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of beautiful plum-coloured velvet. His trousers were bottle green. His gloves were pearly grey. And in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin, there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee, and his eyes were the most marvellously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter, And oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quick, jerky little movements with his head, cocking it this way and that, and taking everything in with those bright, twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a quick, clever old squirrel from the park. Suddenly, he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide, and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my little friends! Welcome to the factory!" His voice was high and fluty. "Will you come forward one at a time, please?" he called out, "and bring your parents. Then show me your golden ticket. Give me your name. Who's first?" A big boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus!" cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with fierce force. "My dear boy, how good to see you! Delighted, charmed, overjoyed you have come with us. And these are your parents? How nice! Come in, that's right. Step through the gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the side of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you will enjoy it. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father, how are you, Mr. Salt? And Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet Beauregard and Mike TV, came forward to have their tickets examined, and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small, nervous boy whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well, so there you are. You are the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you?" Yes, yes, I read all about it in the morning papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad, so happy for you. Your grandfather delighted to meet you, enchanted. Oh, 5 children. Will you follow me, please? The tour is together. Please don't wander off one. At this stage of the proceedings, Charlie glanced back. Iron entrance gates, slowly closed on the outside, were still pushing. Look at them. Then the gates closed all sight of the outside. So, have a think. The story I just read. And who? I'm guessing, and happy World Book Day.
This is how the story begins. On a dark, dark hill, there was a dark, dark town. And in the dark, dark town, there was a dark, dark street. And in the dark, dark street, there was a dark, dark house. In the dark, dark house, there was a dark, dark staircase. Down the dark, dark staircase, there was a dark, dark cellar. And in the dark, dark cellar lived some skeletons. There was a big skeleton, and a small skeleton, and a dog skeleton. One night, the big skeleton sat up in bed and scratched his head. "What shall we do tonight?" he said. "Let's take the dog for a walk," said the small skeleton, "and frighten everyone." "Good idea," said the big skeleton. So the big skeleton and the small skeleton and the dog skeleton left the dark, dark cellar and climbed the dark, dark staircase and stepped into the dark, dark street. They walked past the dark, dark houses and the shops. They walked past the zoo and the police station, and then they went into the park. I'm going to stop here. Can you guess who I am? Can you guess the author of this book? Can you guess the title? And can you guess the genre? Bye everyone.